Welcome back to the darkest chapter of European history. If you watched part 1 of this series, you already know that being poor in medieval Europe wasn't just about hardship. It was a systematic death sentence that claimed millions of lives. But what we covered in part 1 was just the tip of the iceberg. Today, we're diving even deeper into this nightmare. We're going to explore the stories that history books often skip, the women who were treated as breeding stock, the children who were worked to death before they could walk properly, and the forgotten victims whose suffering was so extreme that it defies comprehension. If you thought part 1 was dark, prepare yourself, because what we're about to uncover makes everything we've discussed so far look like mercy. This is part 2 of why being poor in medieval Europe was a death sentence, and this time we're focusing on those who suffered the most. But before we begin, if you missed part 1, I highly recommend watching it first. The foundation we built there will help you understand just how deep this systematic cruelty really went. Let me tell you about Margaret, a serf woman living in the 14th century France. At age 12, she was married off to a man 3 times her age, not because anyone cared about her happiness, but because her lord needed to ensure a steady supply of new workers. By age 25, she had given birth to 8 children. By age 27, she was dead. Margaret's story wasn't unusual, it was the norm. In medieval Europe, poor women existed for exactly 3 purposes: to work, to breed, and to die. They were considered property twice over, first as serfs belonging to their lord, and second as wives belonging to their husbands. The marriage system for poor women was essentially organized rape, sanctioned by law and religion. Girls as young as 12 were married off to men they had never met, often decades older than themselves. The concept of consent didn't exist. A woman's lord could order her to marry anyone he chose, and refusing meant death or exile. But the horror of these forced marriages was just the beginning. Once married, a serf woman was expected to produce children continuously until her body gave out. There was no birth control, no choice, no escape. Pregnancy was a death sentence hanging over every woman's head, and yet it was also their only value to society. The statistics are absolutely staggering. In some regions, maternal mortality rates reached 30%, meaning nearly 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or from childbirth-related complications. But even these numbers don't tell the full story, because they don't account for the women who died during pregnancy, or the women who survived childbirth but died from infections, exhaustion, or malnutrition in the weeks that followed. What makes this even more horrifying is that these deaths were entirely preventable. Wealthy women had access to midwives, better nutrition, and recovery time after birth. They had maternal mortality rates of around 5 to 10%. The difference wasn't medical knowledge, it was social class. Poor women died because their lives weren't considered worth saving. The physical abuse was systematic and legal. A husband could beat his wife as long as he didn't kill her, and even then, he would only be punished for destroying his lord's property. Women who fought back could be publicly flogged, branded, or executed. The law explicitly stated that women were inferior to men and needed to be controlled through violence if necessary. But perhaps the most sadistic aspect was how the system used women's maternal instincts against them. A woman who wanted to keep her children alive had to work harder, endure more abuse, and accept worse conditions. The system knew that threatening a woman's children was the most effective way to ensure her complete submission. Women also faced unique forms of economic exploitation. They were paid less than men for the same work, when they were paid at all. Most of their labor was considered women's work, and therefore worthless. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, textile work, and food preparation were all essential to survival, but they generated no income for the women performing them. The legal system was even more brutal to women than to men. A woman accused of adultery could be burned alive, while a man faced no punishment for the same act. Women accused of witchcraft, often just for knowing herbal medicine or being too independent, faced torture and execution. The witch trials weren't just about superstition, they were about maintaining male control over women's bodies and knowledge. Now let me tell you about little Anna, born in an English village in 1298. At age 4, she was already working in the fields, her tiny hands picking stones from the soil. At age 6, she was carrying heavy water buckets that weighed almost as much as she did. At age 8, she was working 12-hour days during harvest season. At age 10, she was dead, crushed under a cartwheel because she was too weak from malnutrition to get out of the way fast enough. Anna's story represents the systematic murder of childhood that defined medieval Europe. Poor children weren't seen as human beings with needs and rights. They were seen as small adults who could be exploited for profit. The concept of childhood as a protected period of development simply didn't exist for the poor. Child labor wasn't just common, it was mandatory. Children as young as 4 or 5 were put to work in fields, mines, and workshops. Their small size made them useful for certain tasks, like crawling into narrow mine shafts or reaching into dangerous machinery. The fact that this work was killing them was considered an acceptable cost of doing business. The mortality rates for poor children were so high that parents developed psychological coping mechanisms to deal with the constant death. Many parents didn't even name their children until they survived their first year. Others gave the same name to multiple children, expecting that most would die young. Some parents practiced what historians call emotional distancing. They simply didn't allow themselves to become too attached to children who were likely to die. But the most heartbreaking aspect of childhood poverty was how it robbed children of their basic humanity. Poor children were bought and sold like livestock. They could be traded to pay debts, given as gifts, or used as collateral for loans. A child's life had a literal price tag, usually equivalent to a pig or a cow. The education system was deliberately designed to exclude poor children. Learning to read and write was considered a privilege that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. A literate serf might start questioning the system, reading forbidden books, or even writing down complaints against their lord. So education was strictly forbidden to the poor, ensuring that each generation would be as ignorant and controllable as the last. The malnutrition of poor children was so severe that it caused permanent physical and mental damage. Children who survived to adulthood were often severely stunted, with deformed bones, damaged organs, and cognitive impairments. The chronic hunger they experienced wasn't just uncomfortable. It was literally reshaping their bodies and brains. Child abandonment was so common that it became institutionalized. Parents who couldn't feed their children would leave them at church doors, in forests, or by roadsides. Most of these abandoned children died within days, but some were taken in by monasteries or other families, usually to be used as unpaid labor. The sexual exploitation of poor children was rampant and completely legal. Lords had the right to rape any serf child on their land, and parents had no recourse. Child marriage was common, with girls as young as 7 or 8 being married off to adult men. The concept of protecting children from sexual violence didn't exist. Children were property, and property could be used however the owner saw fit. Perhaps most disturbing was how the system used sibling relationships to maintain control. Older children were made responsible for younger ones, creating a system where children policed each other. If a younger child misbehaved, the older child would be punished. This created a pyramid of oppression where even the most powerless members of society were turned against each other. Among all the victims of medieval poverty, perhaps none suffered more than the women who fell outside the narrow roles society had assigned them. Widows, unmarried women, and those who couldn't or wouldn't conform to expectations faced a special kind of hell that combined the worst aspects of poverty, misogyny, and social ostracism. Let me tell you about Eleanor, a woman widowed at age 35 in the 14th century Germany. When her husband died, she didn't just lose her companion. She lost her entire legal existence. As a widow, she had no right to inherit her husband's property, no right to continue working his land, and no right to remain in the house where she had lived for 15 years. She was literally homeless overnight, with 3 young children to feed and no legal way to earn money. The law was deliberately designed to destroy widows. In most regions, a woman's property automatically passed to her husband's male relatives when he died. Even if she had brought wealth to the marriage, even if she had worked to build that wealth, she had no claim to it. She was expected to either remarry immediately or face destitution. But remarriage wasn't always possible or desirable. Many widows were too old to attract new husbands, or they had too many children to be considered desirable. Others refused to remarry because they had experienced abuse in their first marriage. These women faced a choice between slavery and starvation, and the system was designed to ensure that both options led to the same outcome: death. Unmarried women faced an even worse fate. In a society where a woman's only value was her ability to serve a man and bear children, spinsters were considered dangerous aberrations. They were suspected of witchcraft, accused of corrupting other women, and blamed for every misfortune that befell their communities. The economic persecution of single women was systematic and brutal. They were excluded from most trades and professions, forbidden from owning property, and charged higher taxes than married women. They were often forced to live in hovels on the outskirts of towns, surviving on charity that rarely came, and work that barely paid enough to buy bread. But the social ostracism was perhaps even worse than the economic persecution. Unmarried women were treated as pariahs, excluded from religious ceremonies, forbidden from participating in community events, and constantly watched for signs of moral corruption. They were easy targets for accusations of witchcraft, heresy, or adultery, accusations that could result in torture, exile, or death. The elderly women suffered the most. Once they were too old to work or bear children, they became completely expendable. Families would abandon elderly women to die alone. Communities would drive them out during harsh winters, and authorities would refuse them even the most basic assistance. The concept of caring for elderly relatives was considered a luxury that poor families couldn't afford. Perhaps most tragically, many of these women turned to prostitution as their only means of survival. But even this desperate choice offered no real escape from poverty. Prostitutes were subjected to brutal violence, constant disease, and legal persecution. They were often branded, publicly humiliated, or even killed for their profession. But the men who used their services faced no consequences at all. The religious system added another layer of cruelty. While the church preached about caring for widows and orphans, in practice they offered little help to destitute women. Church-run charitable institutions were primarily for wealthy donors who could afford to pay for their care. Poor women were expected to rely on God's mercy, which apparently didn't extend to providing them with food or shelter. If you thought the normal conditions of medieval poverty were bad, imagine what happened when war or famine struck. These weren't just temporary hardships. They were apocalyptic events that pushed already desperate people beyond the limits of human endurance. Let me take you to the English countryside in 1315, during what historians call the Great Famine. For 3 years, the rains didn't stop. Crops rotted in the fields, animals died of disease, and the stored grain supplies ran out. In normal times, poor families were already on the edge of starvation. Now they faced the complete collapse of the food system. The mortality rates during the Great Famine were staggering. In some regions, 10 to 15% of the population died. But these numbers don't capture the full horror of what happened. They don't tell you about the families who ate their own children to survive. They don't tell you about the mass graves filled with the bodies of people who died with their stomachs full of grass, bark, and leather, because there was nothing else to eat. The social order collapsed entirely during famines. Desperate people turned to cannibalism, not just eating the dead, but sometimes killing the weak to feed the strong. Parents abandoned their children, children killed their parents for food, and entire communities turned into war zones where the only law was survival. But the lords and nobles? They continued to live in luxury. They had stored grain, preserved meat, and wine cellars that could sustain them for years. They didn't just survive the famine, they profited from it, buying up the land of dead serfs for pennies and consolidating their power over the survivors. When war came, the suffering was even more systematic. Armies didn't just fight each other, they deliberately targeted civilian populations, destroying crops, burning villages, and slaughtering non-combatants. This wasn't collateral damage, it was strategic warfare designed to break the enemy's ability to feed their army. The poor suffered the most during wartime because they had no defenses. Wealthy families could retreat to fortified castles or flee to distant relatives. Poor families were trapped in their villages, unable to run and unable to fight. They were sitting ducks for any army that wanted to steal their food, rape their women, or conscript their men. The rape and sexual violence during wartime was systematic and brutal. Armies used rape as a weapon of war, not just to satisfy their soldiers, but to demoralize and terrorize the population. Women and girls as young as 8 or 9 were gang raped by entire units of soldiers. Most of these women died from their injuries or from suicide in the aftermath. The conscription of men left women and children completely defenseless. Armies would sweep through villages, taking every man capable of fighting and leaving behind only the elderly, the disabled, women, and children. These communities were then left to fend for themselves with no protection and no able-bodied workers. The psychological trauma of living through these events was severe and long-lasting. Survivors often developed what we would now recognize as PTSD, but medieval society had no understanding of mental health. Traumatized survivors were often seen as possessed by demons or cursed by God, leading to further persecution and isolation. Perhaps most cruelly, the authorities often blamed the victims for their own suffering. Famines were seen as God's punishment for sin, and the poor were told that they were starving because they hadn't been faithful enough. War was portrayed as divine justice, and rape victims were often blamed for tempting their attackers. One of the most insidious aspects of medieval poverty was how it created a hierarchy of suffering that turned victims against each other. The system was designed to ensure that even the most oppressed people had someone below them to oppress, preventing unity and rebellion. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the disabled, the mentally ill, and the physically deformed. These people were seen as cursed by God, possessed by demons, or punishment for their parents' sins. They were often abandoned by their families, driven out of communities, and left to die alone. Let me tell you about Thomas, a boy born with a clubfoot in the 12th century Scotland. His parents saw his deformity as a sign of God's displeasure and abandoned him in the forest when he was just 3 years old. He survived by eating scraps and begging, but his disability made him an easy target for abuse. Other children threw stones at him, adults kicked him when he begged for food, and authorities regularly beat him for the crime of being visible. Thomas lived for 12 years this way, never knowing kindness, never experiencing safety, never having enough to eat. When he finally died, probably from an infected wound, no one mourned him. His body was thrown into an unmarked grave with other undesirables, forgotten by history and ignored by God. The treatment of the mentally ill was even more brutal. People with mental illness were seen as dangerous demons who needed to be contained or destroyed. They were often chained in dark cellars, beaten regularly to drive out the evil spirits, and subjected to treatments that would be considered torture today. Ethnic minorities faced their own special persecution. Jews, Muslims, and other religious minorities were blamed for everything from bad weather to cattle disease. They were forced to live in ghettos, wear identifying clothing, and pay special taxes. During times of crisis, they were often scapegoated and subjected to pogroms that killed thousands. The Roma people, then called gypsies, were particularly targeted. They were seen as inherently criminal and evil, and laws were passed specifically to persecute them. They could be enslaved, murdered, or driven out of communities with no legal consequences. Children were often taken from Roma families and sold as slaves. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this hierarchy was how it affected relationships within families. Disabled children were often killed by their own parents, not out of cruelty, but out of desperate necessity. Families couldn't afford to feed a child who couldn't work, and keeping a disabled child alive might mean watching their other children starve. The elderly were similarly expendable. Once they became too old to work, they were often abandoned by their families. In some cultures, this abandonment was ritualized. Elderly people were expected to walk into the wilderness and die alone to avoid being a burden on their families. Women who couldn't have children were treated as failures and often abandoned by their husbands. In a society where a woman's only value was her ability to reproduce, infertility was seen as a fundamental character flaw. These women often ended up as the lowest of the low, with no family to protect them and no social role to give them value.